to be here today. I think our mission, because we're sitting over the border in Egypt, and up until probably the revolution in Egypt, a lot of people had forgotten about the southern border because it's been relatively peaceful for some time. This is basically what I'm going to cover in my brief today. And I'm not going to give a history lesson because I think you probably know better than I do the history of your region. But, you know, it can be characterised since the very difficult birth of the Israeli state with lots and lots of wars. And we had two very, very brave men, Sadat and Begin. Sadat lost his life for taking that brave stand of deciding that war wasn't worth it. And that, you know, you look at the conflict between Israel and Egypt and what a waste it had been. And Jimmy Carter, of course, who provided the catalyst for a lot of the talks, culminating in the peace treaty in 1979. Why do I wear that? Why don't I have that blue thing? Well, it didn't suit certain countries, and within the Arab world, Egypt was vilified for signing the treaty with Israel and backed by the then Soviet Union. Basically, the Security Council would not agree to a UN mandate because the Soviet Union had said they would veto any UN force in the Sinai. So the two parties basically went back to the US and said, can you help facilitate a mission? And that's when the protocols to the treaty were signed, and then the MFO stood up on the 25th of April 1982. Also happens to be Anzac Day, which is the Remembrance Day for Australians and New Zealanders. And as you can quickly work out, we had our birthday the other day, 30 years. Yariv and a team from Israel and a team from Egypt came across to North Camp. It was very much a working thing. It's a work in progress. It's not a time to pat ourselves on the back.
30 years is not just nothing.
One of the things I won't talk about in this presentation is what happens in the headquarters in Rome. Why is our headquarters in Rome? Well, it had to be a country that had good relations with Israel and Egypt. Rome's actually not a bad place to live as well, and I think they made a pretty good choice. The other thing I will not talk about are violations to the treaty, because the only people they are shared with is the State of Israel and the Arab Republic of Egypt. We too have a pretty simple mission, and I'll let you read it. But I think it goes much further, and it goes back to what Yariv said. We're there also to facilitate trust and to continue to try and build and maintain that relationship. That relationship, or trying to build that relationship, has probably been more important over the last 15 months than probably the previous 28 years, because I think prior to the fall of Mubarak, you had a real commitment from the head of state, and that doesn't necessarily exist as we go forward. It will be interesting because it's always easy, I think, for politicians when they're in opposition. When they get into power, reality strikes them, and what they may criticise may become too difficult once they're there and making it work. So our mission is pretty simple: to observe, report and verify violations of the Treaty of Peace. How do we do it? Well, we're an interesting little organisation. Once again, like the UN, multiple countries, some from the South Pacific, from some South America, North America and Europe. It's interesting to note that this is Colombia's only mission overseas. We New Zealanders quite regularly get to work with the Uruguayans around the world in UN missions, and a lot of those other places New Zealanders don't get to see very often. The Czechs, the Hungarians and the Italians. We tend to work with most of the others quite regularly our Fijian friends, even though there are political problems between our two countries, or three countries, Australia, New Zealand, Fiji at present. And how are we funded? I think this is critical too to the success of the mission, in that the two host nations are funding the mission as well. The funding is divided three ways between Israel, Egypt, the United States, and then we have these wonderful people called donor nations that give us some extra money, and that money may be tied to particular things. Some countries have said it's to be used for non-military things. That's fine, because we have the Civilian Observer Unit, and that's where the money goes. So that's basically what our force looks like. How are we organised? As I said, I've got my boss in Rome, and it's a really good relationship because we have a direct link. I do sort of have a political advisor, but it's up to me whether I talk to him or listen to him or not. He's the civilian head of the Civilian Observer Unit, who is a very senior State Department person who's seconded to the MFO. His links with the State Department are severed whilst he's with the MFO. The Director General will always be an American. The Force Commander will never be an American, and that's in the treaty. We have representatives in Cairo and Tel Aviv with small staff, and they do a lot of the liaison with organisations, particularly up in Jerusalem, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, with the IDF, the same in Cairo, and they do a lot of the purchasing for us. The force itself, I have 4 colonels. My Chief of Staff, who is an American, my Chief of Support, who's American, my Chief of Liaison, who's Canadian, currently a French-Canadian, and then my Chief of Operations, who's Norwegian.
Any women?
Yes, we do have women. In fact, the DGR Cairo is a female and is a former head of the Civilian Observer Unit. Have we had a New Zealand contingent commander who's been a woman? No, not yet. But we have normally about 20% of the New Zealand contingent are women, and scattered right throughout the force. Even the Colombians have women across there. And that's very difficult for them, because when you look at what they're doing in their country when they're fighting a counter-revolutionary warfare, integrating women into the defence force has been probably more difficult for them than countries like Canada, Australia, New Zealand. Fiji is increasingly deploying women overseas as well. So we have our 3 infantry battalions, one from Fiji, one from Colombia, and one from the United States. The CPU is the Coastal Patrol Unit, and the Italians were very, very generous to the MFO. 4 ships specifically built for the task of maintaining the freedom of passage through the Strait of Tiran, which was seen as a key task in the treaty. The Civilian Observer Unit, always American, 50% secondees from the State Department, 50% retired military. Normally the retired military will stay for 2 to about 21 years, I think was the record set by one person, whereas the State Department people are normally only with us for 1 or 2 years. Liaison, everybody. I think the only contingents that aren't represented in liaison are the Australians and the Czechs. Ops, as I said, a Norwegian heads it, his deputies are an Australian and a New Zealander, and then you've got at least one of every person from every contingent in it. So it is truly multinational. The Force Military Police Unit from Hungary, and that's supplemented by people from Fiji, Colombia, the United States. The Chief of Support's team is a real mixture. Whilst the Americans take a lead, and there's a wonderful agreement, for example, when the French pulled out their fixed-wing aircraft, there is an agreement that if they cannot find a country that will step in, the United States will provide. So currently we have Sherpas from the United States. The helicopters in the force were originally provided by Australia and New Zealand. They were replaced by the Canadians, and now the helicopters are American. And so the support battalion, whilst there's a lot of Americans in there, there's a lot of other people that I'll talk about shortly. Medical, primarily American, but there's Hungarian, Uruguayan, Fijian, Colombian, so it's a pretty mixed group of people. ICT, a lot of civilians from all sorts of places. In fact, I counted up the other day, we have 79 people from the United Kingdom working for us at present. But you take a little contingent like Uruguay, they provide our engineering and heavy driving capability. The New Zealanders, whilst they provide a smattering of staff officers, they also provide some drivers under command of the Uruguayans. Makes for a challenge. New Zealanders are a bit like people from the United States, pretty monolingual. So putting New Zealanders with Uruguayans, who generally only speak Spanish and the Kiwis speak English. Sort of, yes. So that's how we're sort of structured. Where are we? Well, North Camp, about 10 kilometres south of the Mediterranean Sea, about 15 kilometres from the Gaza Strip. It's on an old Israeli airbase. We take up about 25% of that airbase. An interesting place. South Camp, built from scratch in Sharm el-Sheikh, now surrounded by hotels, but it still looks very much like in that photograph. There are 1 or 2 palm trees around, but not too many. Then we have 30 remote sites, those little triangles scattered throughout Zone Charlie, and I'll talk about the zones in a minute. And then we have the 2 border crossings, Nitzana, El Agua, which is a freight crossing point between Egypt and Israel that the MFO is able to use, or Eilat Taba, long way to go down to Eilat or Taba. About a 7.5, 8 hour drive between North Camp and South Camp. Logistics. Because we are spread over a pretty big area, we try and use best practice. Self-sufficiency at remote sites sounds pretty simple. When I talk about some of the challenges, you'll see even that is becoming challenging now. We try and maintain 7 days. I think we're up to about 14 to 21 days that they can survive by themselves. We did get to a situation we were literally counting down the days where we're going to have to withdraw people from a remote site. We rely heavily on commercial systems. About 4 weeks ago, we had a 25,000 litre truck of gas that got within 4 kilometres of North Camp and was stopped. We think probably about 15,000 litres of that went to the Gaza Strip and 10,000 litres to people around the North Sinai. We have a 5-year planning horizon, which makes it easier to do long-term planning. Even though we're a temporary mission, you don't know how long temporary is. And as I said, we have procurement officers in both Egypt and Israel and try and spend money between the 2 nations pretty equally. I think this is important, the zones of consideration. Why are we there? And it's amazing when we talk to the staff colleges in Egypt, how little knowledge in Egypt there is of the Treaty of Peace, how little knowledge there is of the war, the last war that was fought, and what this is all about. This is often seen for young Egyptians as an insult to the sovereignty of Egypt in the Sinai. Obviously Zone A, where their military is allowed to operate. Zone B, where they can have 4 border guard force battalions. Zone C, theoretically, ARE police only. I'll talk about the exceptions soon. And then we have Zone D, which is a very narrow sliver of about 3 kilometres wide in Israel, and you can read it as good as I can. That becomes very important to us. That little box up the top, we'll talk about that in a minute as well. How do we do our job of observing, reporting and verifying? Well, Zone C, we're the only we're the only military that's supposed to be in Zone C. Why have we got the US bat in the south, Coal bat in the middle and Fiji bat up north? Initially, when the mission was set up, the Gulf of Aqaba was seen as the key terrain and probably the area where there were going to be most problems. The US bat probably has the quietest time of any of our people at present, and the CPU, wonderful visiting them. The hosting ability of the Italians is fantastic. The pasta is pretty good, as is their grappa. Coal bat have a pretty interesting area. They have one site that they call Infierno, or hell. In summer, 40, 42 degrees. In 30 years, they've never seen a Bedouin, a donkey, a camel, a contrail in the sky, or anything. But if anything happened, they would be in the front row of the grandstand. It is probably the major invasion route across the Sinai. So, dependent on which side decided to not abide by the treaty and go the other way, that's one of the reasons why they're there. Fiji bat probably have the most interesting area and the most difficult. And right at the top of the Fiji bat area was that little area circled, which is the Border Guard Force area, which was a separate agreement signed between Israel and Egypt post the withdrawal of Israel from the Gaza Strip, and recognising that Gaza is also a problem to Egypt, it allowed for certain forces to be put into that area. I can tell you it is the most detailed agreement you could imagine, and I've been out on the missions where people are literally counting RPGs and RPG rounds, how many pistols, how many rifles, how many sand buggies, how many water trucks. So that's pretty important. And this was another one that I think is really important that Yarif talked about, the liaison system. This is one of the big strengths of the MFO. There is superb liaison all the way through. The Director General has worked in this region of the world for many, many years. He has superb contacts in both Israel and Egypt at the more political, diplomatic level. I work very closely with Yariv's boss, General Orion, and in Egypt, General Osama. I try not to ring them unless it's a big problem. You want problems to be dealt with at the lowest level possible. This is not a criticism of anybody, okay? That is easier to do on the Israeli side than on the Egyptian side because of history and the structures and the way their militaries have developed. But those relationships are just so important. I do have the staff come to me sometimes and say, can you ring General Orion? I said, I'm not ringing General Orion until you let the person in Taba have time to solve the problem. Because if I go over his head, he could lose face, and then he can make life very, very difficult for us. But those relationships are very, very close, and when we have our meetings in North Camp, it is great to see the Israeli and Egyptian liaison systems getting together as well. And I think the relationship has become much closer since January. I think in my first year, I would say General Amir and General Hyman might have spoke twice, 3 times outside normal meetings. Really interesting being at a dinner with General Amir and the phone rings and I've got General Hyman on it trying to say, you've got to convince him that that rocket did come from the Sinai. This was when Eilat and Aqaba were shelled. Since then, some days the generals and the staff could be talking 5, 6, 7 times a day, so it's superb. And this is, to me, one of the most important things we do, is facilitate trust. And it's through that liaison system, and it's that people-to-people contact that you can solve a lot of problems. We have regular meetings. There's the trilateral in Rome once a year. We in the MFO, when the Israelis and Egyptians want to get together in a bilateral, we'll either facilitate it for them in North Camp, or we'll move people from Egypt to Israel or Israel to Egypt for those meetings. We don't know what goes on in those meetings till afterwards, when I can say to General Osama, well, what did you talk about? Or General Orion, what did you talk about? And then you see how the meeting went, whether you get the same story or a different story. But it is very important, and I think we all get on pretty well, don't we, Yuriv?
Sure.
Now, I want to talk about some of the challenges, and a lot of these challenges have really manifested themselves in a much, much bigger way since January 2011. But the first one is an easy one. I think it's a common problem to a lot of international missions: language. People from the United States have trouble understanding my English. The Australians, we might both speak English, but we use it in different ways. The Colombian Spanish is different to the Uruguayan Spanish. And then when you've got Czechs, Hungarians, French Canadians, and I watched one of our French staff and a French Canadian having a go at one another over the merits of the French that they speak in Canada. They weren't talking by the end of the night. It does create a problem for us. It creates a problem with liaison as well. That, the first language of the liaison system is English, but the only couple of people in the liaison system in the MFO that have English as a first language is a New Zealander and an American. Sometimes a Canadian, but as I say, currently we have a French Canadian. And, language can be a problem. Sinai is different from the rest of Egypt. 30 Bedouin tribes. In the past, not really constrained by boundaries. They would look more to Saudi Arabia, Jordan, Iraq than they would look to the Nile Valley. The two governorates in the Sinai are the two poorest in Egypt. There is a real underclass there. About 400,000 people living in the Sinai. Of that, about 15-20% are Palestinians. There is a lot of tension growing between the government and the Bedouin, and it's over basic things like access to education, to jobs, to land ownership, to ID cards, to being able to serve in the armed forces and the police. Terrorist activity. This has grown phenomenally. We had a couple of incidents back in 2004, 2005, about the time of the Taba bombings. This is the new fence that you're building down in the south. That will also create some challenges for us too. But I think the one that I want to talk about is if you look at arms smuggling. And when the Egyptians are now talking to us about the arms that are coming through the Sinai, I also heard today that it can work the other way. It's not all going to Gaza. An AK-47 in the Gaza, about 300 shekels. In Rafah, 1,000 shekels. So AK-47s are now moving the other way out of Gaza into the Sinai. We now get to see vehicles, technicals, with heavy machine guns on the back. This was probably the first big incident that we've had since the revolution, where one of our remote sites was isolated by the Bedouin. As you can see, the new camel of the desert, the Toyota Hilux, about 60 people. That's quite challenging when you're 15 people at a remote site. Burning tyres, they took the lights out, came under the wire during the night. As you can see, that was the entrance gate to the place. Basically told that if we don't get what we want from the Egyptian government, we will overrun your site at 3:30 tomorrow. They don't have anything against us, okay? We are just a tool to be used to get the Egyptian government's attention. Earlier this year, North Camp, we were isolated in North Camp for 9 days. All the roads were blocked. We couldn't use the airfield. Once again, a way of attracting the attention of the government. I had it explained to me, when they burnt another tyre, that meant we needed to ring Lawio to say, you know, ring the military intelligence division to find out what's going on. The perimeter fence was cut in a couple of places. We were back briefed that this was a couple of young guys and they were dealt to by the local sheikh because that was taking it a step too far. Just some statistics. And stone throwing seems pretty innocuous. It's actually getting very dangerous now. We've got a liaison officer that had a broken arm or has got a broken arm from being hit by a rock. Someone gets hit in the head. As it comes through the window, you know, we could have a death. Shootings near MFO. These aren't shootings at us, but it's just giving you an idea of how many more weapons that we're seeing around the Sinai. It might be celebration for a wedding. More often than not, it could be a family feud. Or interclanal stuff because there isn't the police around anymore. The driving environment for our people is pretty horrific. So that gives you an idea of some of the challenges. But as I say, for 30 years, and whilst North Camp was blocked, the civilian observer unit were able to do their missions of verifying what the Egyptians had in Zone A, B, C, and then what the Israelis have in Zone D. So with all these problems, and this creates a huge change for the way we operate as a force. We're working much closer with the Egyptians. We've gone through a period where theoretically, because we're working in two sovereign states, they are supposed to provide the security for us. We haven't necessarily been able to rely on that, but when it counts, they have been there. So hopefully that gives you a bit of an idea about us, the MFO. Thank you.
Thank you very much.